We can't protect our own borders, but we are going to send British troops to protect Ukraine's, apparently. Today is a huge day for Britain, Europe and the world. It started with this.
We must continue to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, whatever happens next, and to make sure that if there is peace, and we all want peace, that it is lasting, that this isn't just about the front line in Ukraine, it's the front line of Europe and of the United Kingdom. It's about our national security, and I think that we need to do more. We need to step up in terms of our collective response in Europe.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that he would be willing to deploy UK troops in Ukraine, a huge statement that could have massive consequences for Britain. Then, representatives of the United States landed in Saudi Arabia. They are set to meet with Russia to discuss a peace deal for Ukraine. Russia's defence minister slammed European leaders and said they should not be anywhere near these negotiations.
The
European philosophy hasn't gone anywhere, so I don't know what they should do at the negotiating table. They're going to weasel out some cunning ideas about freezing the conflict, while actually intending, as is their custom, nature and habit, to continue this war. Then why should we invite them?
So European leaders held their own summit instead. And when it finished, Keir Starmer came out and said this.
Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground, alongside others, if there is a lasting peace agreement.
But here's the rub for me. Do these European elites, our leaders, have any right to tell us that they care about Europe? That they are willing to defend Europe at all costs? This guy, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, was crying his eyes out after JD Vance said the truth, that they've let an enemy into Europe already, and that it's ruining our lives.
After the speech of Vice President Vance on Friday, we have to fear that our common value base is not that common anymore. Let me conclude, and this becomes difficult.
Yeah, great to see strong men on the world stage, isn't it? Anyway, was he crying when he heard of the failed Afghan asylum seeker suspected of ramming his car into a crowd and killing people?
Oh, shit. Okay.
Was he crying when a Saudi Arabian did this at a Christmas market?
A breaking news update now. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry is now condemning an attack on a Christmas market in Germany that killed one toddler and one adult.
Right across Europe, we see sex attacks carried out by so-called asylum seekers or recent migrants.
A day after the allegations of mass sexual assault were made public, Cologne continues to search for the perpetrators and for answers. How could things get so out of hand?
I'll tell you how things could get so out of hand, because European leaders let a load of, at times, barbaric individuals move into our continent. Here in Britain, we have a police force arresting a woman on suspicion of Islamist terror charges, then putting out this mugshot of her in a full niqab to protect her cultural sensitivities. We've got the pro-Palestine mob running amok almost every single week. Police there rushing to protect the cenotaph. We've got immigration judges dictating that we should take Gazan refugees and letting a Jamaican drug dealer stay in Britain as long as he promises to only smoke cannabis and not do harder drugs or sell them. Britain is the Western capital of Sharia courts, with 85 Sharia courts. How did we let that happen? In towns and cities right across Britain, we've had Pakistani rape gangs. 2/3 of suspects in sex attacks in London are foreigners. Finland published their list of sex crimes by nationality, and it revealed that Syrians were 15 times more likely to commit those crimes than the average native population. Afghans and Congolese, 12 times more likely. Iraqis, 10 times more likely. Somalis, 6 times as likely. European leaders chose to let that problem in. In Britain, We send billions of pounds abroad, in some cases, to monitor the health of shrimp in Bangladesh. But at home, we have pensioners freezing to death. We've slashed the size of our armed forces. You could fit Britain's entire standing army into Old Trafford Football Stadium with room to spare, and the forces that we have kept, we make them live in squalid conditions like this, with damp, riddled with pests. You wouldn't put a dog in that, would you? The RAF discriminated against white men. It didn't employ pilots who were willing to fight and die for Britain because they were white and male. And in towns, up and down the country, and cities, were plonking young, foreign, often Middle Eastern or North African men in hotels, and there have been accusations in some cases of them hanging around schools, harassing girls in school uniform. And yet we are now told by our European leaders, the elites, that they care about defending Europe from Putin. There they are today, grandstanding together, telling us about how much they want to protect Europe. Well, how can we believe a word they say when they've set about ruining this continent and making our lives worse and less safe for the last couple of decades? Let's go towards my panel this evening. We've got senior political correspondent at The Express, Christian Cowgie, political consultant and former Conservative advisor, Laura McKever, and also, of course, as well, journalist Benjamin Busworth. Christian, I'll start with you. Look, for me, it's just a bit rich that these European leaders seem to be grandstanding now, telling us about how much they care about Europe and European values, when they don't seem to have expressed much of an interest in them recently.
I think it's a very, very fair point. And, of course, there is only any ethical, moral, logical point of defending Europe from Russia if we know what we're fighting for, what we're trying to preserve. And I think many voters in this country and across Europe, as polls are suggesting, increasingly feel like the societies are not those that they put much value by. I also think it's very interesting. We seem to have a chronic problem in Britain of sort of being shrinking violets on the international stage when we should be throwing our weight around. And yet on foreign policy, sometimes the Foreign Office and the Prime Minister, and when it comes to deploying the army, seem to still be in the mindset that we have an empire and that we're a massively relevant factor and that we could scare the Russians somehow. Now, I do think there's possibly an argument, so long as this is a peacekeeping role, that having NATO troops in Ukraine could be a disincentive to Russia. But let's also not forget that we have fewer than 20,000 deployable troops. Yeah. Well, what's that going to do? Russia could wipe that out at full pelt in a couple of months. And they're not the children of politicians that they're sending to fight and die. They're ordinary Brits, and we have to be so level-headed when it comes to deploying troops.
I think it's really important to remember that there are some politicians who have sons and daughters in the military in this country. The military is a fairly representative entity in the United Kingdom, and I think it's really quite nasty to imply that it isn't. This is being proposed only in the guise of it being a peacekeeping effort, and part of the reason the Prime Minister is talking about this today, part of the reason that European leaders are talking about this today, is because of what Donald Trump is doing at the moment, threatening to carve up Ukraine's mineral deposits, looking like he's going to send a bill to Ukraine for US financial involvement in Ukraine that makes the Versailles Treaty look like a cakewalk. There is a very real problem in Ukraine with Russia. Russia has invaded the nearest border that Europe has with Russia. Ukraine is arguably significantly more European than it is Russian in many ways. This is not just some Russian breakaway territory. This is a country in its own right that was invaded, and that arguably we should have been helping out when Crimea was invaded in 2014. I think there's two completely different arguments here. I think that argument is an important one, and it is important to deal with the fact that our borders are not secure. I also think that we have a very real existential, generational threat in Russia, the likes of which Munich has not seen since 1938. And I think it's incredibly important that liberal, and I do mean liberal in the best sense of the word, free countries like the United Kingdom stand up and say, this is not all right. You are bombing parts of a country that are not yours. It is absolutely unacceptable behaviour. We should be involved in this. But what Keir Starmer is talking about is peacekeeping, and he's doing it because Donald Trump is making noises about forcing a peace deal in Ukraine. And if he does that, we should absolutely be there to make sure it's the best possible deal.
Benjamin, we've seen European leaders and the elites, as I call them, actually remarkably quiet when it comes to things like the mass Cologne sex attack that we've seen, whether it's come to, we've had in this country as well, with the Pakistani rape gangs. I mean, that was frankly not really spoken about for a very, very long period of time. Can you understand why people feel quite annoyed when they see certain European elites now talking about how we must defend Europe at all costs, when actually a lot of people think that frankly, that they've made decisions that have made our lives worse, less safe and damaged our culture for the last couple of decades?
Well, look, pardon me, I think your monologue did an impressive job being translated from its original Russian. Because, frankly, it is people in Russia that want to have that divide and rule tactics, that want culture war issues, which they so often propagate in their own country and speak of in Europe, to divide us so that we are distracted from what they are doing. And J.D. Vance, frankly, has walked straight into that, and they know what they're doing because they're just being selfish as America.
So there's any hypocrisy at all?
No.
I will just say for the record, though, because you made an astonishing accusation, which appears to be that I'm some kind of KGB bot, right? I'm not. I don't want to see Putin win.
You're far too well dressed for that.
Yeah. What he did was wrong. It's unacceptable. And by the way, if Vladimir Putin had invaded Carlisle, for example, I wouldn't want him to have an inch of that ground. I make that very clear. But I think it's important to point out the hypocrisy where we see it, which is that European leaders have been keen to just really dump this ridiculous multicultural ideology on us, at the same time as saying now that we have to protect Europe's external border from Russia. And I find that massively hypocritical.
Well, first of all, the idea that they weren't talking about grooming gangs is completely wrong. There was an investigation 2 years ago. There'd been loads of attention to it, and it quite rightly gets more attention. The questions that we have about our own borders are perfectly legitimate in terms of the different cultures and different nationalities that come into it. But they are completely separate to this question, and to try and water down the seriousness of the threat, which is greater than anything else we have faced in our parents' generation, let alone our generation, not since our grandparents. And you speak to that age group and they know the terrors of what's going on, the final people that remember the Second World War. And we've been subjected in the last few days to Trump bootlickers from Reform, people like Richard Tice going around saying that Ukraine should give up some of its land. We didn't do that as Britain. They didn't do that in the Falklands. How can it be that you have a situation where right-wing parties that so often talk about sovereignty and borders are saying that a country, a modern, liberal, democratic European country, should have its borders compromised for a demagogue that would gladly take Moldova and Belarus and Poland given a chance?
And the Baltic states.
This is the Chamberlain attitude, and we should be terrified of anyone making excuses for it.
What do you think of that? Because there is that case, and I'm not necessarily opposed to that argument, but what I also think is that £3 billion a year indefinitely every single... I mean, it's going to go up now, isn't it? I don't like our oil and gas prices. I don't like how much it's costing me to heat my flat. I don't like the fact that when I go to the supermarket, it's costing me a huge amount more money. And part of me is thinking there's a vast swathe of the British public that will be happy for Ukraine to lose a bit of land if it meant that we stopped sending a load of money over there.
Well, I think... My gut instinct about where the British public are on this is they'll be quite bullish about what Keir Starmer said today, because one thing that Reform, I think, often fail to realise is that American voters and British voters are not the same, whether they're on the right or the left. British voters are, by and large, overwhelmingly supportive of Ukraine and everything we should be proud of having done to support them. My concern with where this goes is that British politicians will be jingoistic and patriotic and altruistic and all the rest of it, and a British troop may get shot, and at that point, British public opinion could turn very quickly, and politicians could regret not having cooler heads about this. I also think that for all the talk about whether this is... What peace deal are we talking about here? Because we've heard Donald Trump basically sounding like a rip-off slum landlord now, trying to extort resources from Ukraine at an appallingly high level. Russia, obviously, Putin does not want to be humiliated. Ukraine seems to be being left out of this conversation, let alone Europe. I mean, Russia obviously don't want Europe involved because we're on the side of the Ukraine.
The only European country that should be involved is us. Germany sent a few hundred helmets when it looked like Putin was going to take Kyiv.
Well, it sounds...
And we sent actual hardware.
Well, no, let's be really clear here. The Netherlands sent hardware, arguably before we got our stuff together on sending aviation hardware. The Netherlands sent hardware. The Baltic states have put in a lot of money.
Yeah.
Europe has responded as the United Kingdom has. Germany has failed. There is no question. But France has been leading on this. The Netherlands have been leading on this. The Baltic states have been leading on this. We have not stood alone in this argument. But were we to pull out now, we would be standing alone with our European neighbours.
We're not going to put troops there.
The
country that neighbours it and Germany are not going to put troops in. Why should we?
There's a recent historical precedent for this, and actually today is Kosovo Independence Day. Kosovo, a country that has now been peaceful for 26 years and has been a country since 2007, and I've been to Kosovo many times. There are British troops, there are NATO troops there that keep the peace between Kosovo and Serbia. Serbia being close to Russia, so a very relevant aggressor, and that has worked, and we do not hear that being questioned. We know that that was a success. Indeed, in Afghanistan, I thought Joe Biden's most reprehensible policy was to take troops out of Afghanistan, because relatively speaking, that
I'm not necessarily...
The Kosovo thing is very interesting because, of course, it was the early military successes of Tony Blair, including Kosovo, that led him to think that led him to think, oh, well, we'll do Iraq now. We've had a lot. So yes, looking at history is very important, but thinking, making direct comparisons between Chamberlain or whatever. We've got to take every issue on their own.
It's also fairly negative about Chamberlain, who arguably bought us a year. The Munich conference is by academics considered to have been viewed fairly inaccurately at the time as being a surrender, when actually it bought us a year to rearm in a way that was helpful to us.
It is clearly an unbelievably complex issue, right? And I think, we've got a range of views here about it. I am not necessarily against what is being said today about the idea that maybe some kind of peacekeeping force would go there. I can see that we do have a responsibility. I would hate it if we had to give up any of our own sovereign territory. Make all that very clear. For me, there is just this hypocrisy that when you walk around this country and you see parts of it that just simply do not resemble Great Britain anymore, you walk around Europe, the whole continent's got less safe, and the same people who've been willing to inflict that upon us appear, in my view...
Did you know, by the way...
Desperate to protect Europe's borders.
Did you know that Donetsk was founded by a Welshman?
No.
We have as much right to Donetsk as Putin is claiming that he does. We should take it back for a Greater Wales. That's the logic that Putin is working on.
I just think there's also massive hypocrisy, isn't there? We're okay. We're less safe. We've got armed police at Christmas markets now because our politicians did not protect us from that threat.
I suppose.
But we're going to potentially compromise British lives.
I suppose we just need to hope that Russian troops don't arrive in small boats on the coast of Italy, because then they'll be in.
Well, this is it, isn't it?
But those are consequences of democratically elected governments and politicians for which you can disagree and agree furiously on a channel like this. All I want is for Ukraine to have the right to do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.